Welcome to Best of Reddit. Be sure to subscribe as we upload new content daily. A few years ago, at the age of 22, I was diagnosed with epilepsy, which came out of the blue. In my appointments with the epilepsy nurse and my neurologist, I was informed, by way of informing those who were looking for a cause for my epilepsy, that I had suffered from measles when I was around 13 months old, and was not yet fully vaccinated against it. Upon returning home, I spoke with my sister and remarked that I had never heard of this before. In private, my sister decided that, as it was me who was involved, I had the right to know what she knew of the story. However, she was only 8 years old at the time and was unsure of the true extent of what had transpired. The story that she told me was as follows. Shortly after I was born, a family moved onto our street, and they had a son who was around my sister's age. My sister wasn't fond of him. He was a bit pushy, but not in an unkind way. He likely just wanted to make friends and pushed his way into playing with the other children. My sister, however, has an anxiety disorder, and has had it for a long time, and she didn't really appreciate his behavior, finding him quite intimidating. She knew very little about his parents, and has never actually spoken to them. About a year later, I came down with the measles and was rushed to the hospital with severe complications. My sister explained that, as far as she was aware, the family was opposed to vaccinations and believed that the only way to build a natural immunity was to be infected with a virus. This was before the falsified study linking vaccines to autism. As such, when their unvaccinated son contracted the measles, the first thing that they thought of was to do the other families on the street a favor and send their infectious son out to play with the other children without warning anybody. My sister inadvertently brought the virus into the house, and we were both infected. She shrugged it off, but I wasn't so lucky. 21 years later, I would find out that this virus and the seizures that it caused at the time caused scarring in my brain that has left me with epilepsy and all of the joys that come with that. Lovely stuff. I returned from the hospital after an anticlimactic recovery, and a month later, the family disappeared. Until recently, that was all that I knew of the situation. My parents were understandably traumatized by the whole thing, and they didn't like to talk about it. So I dropped it into conversation with an elderly neighbor who was not in any way affiliated with what happened at the time. I was informed that, while I was in the hospital, my grandmother, who has passed away, had confronted the family over what they had done during a time when it was still possible that I might have died. Their response had made my grandmother livid, and she had gone around telling everyone what they had said, which was essentially something to the effect of, "You should be thanking us. She'll be much safer now that she's had it. She'll have a more natural immunity, now." To my neighbor's knowledge, nobody liked that, and for good reason. On top of that, parents didn't feel safe with him around, and there were other infants on the street who were my age or younger. People hurled abuse at him, he recalled, and they ended up leaving to stay with relatives before the house could even be sold. It was only recently that the extent of the abuse was relayed to me by another neighbor who may or may not have taken part in it all. Their tires were slashed multiple times, almost as soon as they were replaced. Their car was keyed. When people weren't hurling abuse at him in the street, the worst of all being my grandmother who had a razor-sharp wit, always being able to come up with something new and unique, they wrote handwritten letters calling them every obscene name under the sun and reminding them that they could be responsible for my death, posting them through their mailbox and sticking them to their windows and doors. The resident baseball boy, with the blessing of everybody present, tore their letterbox off their wall and smashed it in with a baseball bat. One of the residents on the street had a pair of cats, and when they brought any little presents home, she would scoop up the unfortunate prey with a shovel and leave them on the doorstep. This evolved to include the waste of the cats, too, and another neighbor who had a dog decided to do the same with his dog's droppings. This would be done primarily when they were out of the house, and this was being done in the heat of summer, so you can only imagine the smell and the cloud of flies that would be wafting around their porch when they returned hours later. The owner of the dog even went as far as to smear the droppings all over their door handle and as much of their front window as he could, though people found this just a wee bit disgusting, so he stopped. While the abuse and letters kept up, people very quickly stopped leaving droppings and such on their porch, or sticking the letters to their windows because, unfortunately, their young lad, who was about 7 to 8, got caught in the crossfire. Some of the older children caught on to the fact that their parents didn't like his family and began to bully him without really ever knowing why his family was hated so much, and this ended up reaching him at school. To their credit, they realized that he likely didn't understand what was going on, and it wasn't his fault, so they dialed it back a bit and kept the abuse to where only the parents could see. This family was so distressed that they took their son and ran to the sibling of one of the parents after the sibling of the other told them quite frankly that they didn't want their unvaccinated son around their children. The house was sold in their absence. I wondered aloud why the police weren't called, because some of the perpetrators were very obvious, at which point I was informed that these people had an inherent distrust of any and all authority figures and held the belief that the system was against them, they were being oppressed, and that the police would sweep it all under the rug, so they just left instead of exposing their son to the biased police, which is really baffling to me, because in my country, their community is a majority, and they'd be more likely to receive support. So, the moral of the story is to vaccinate your children, folks.